ultimate security awareness training program for your staff. I am your webinar moderator and organizer, Jill Rose. And I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping tips before we get started. Everyone has been placed on mute just to cut down on any background noise. So if you have any questions, you can use the question box to ask anything during the event, or we'll also open up for Q&A at the end. Also, this webinar is being recorded, and we'll put it up on our website a little bit later today so you can download it. With that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce today's presenter, Mr. Ben Schmerler, TP Solutions Senior IT Risk Advisor. Ben, take it away.
Thank you very much, Jill, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. As anybody who knows me can tell, I'm a big believer in creating security awareness and a culture of security within organizations. In addition to all the technical stuff that we always do for you, from the very basic stuff like antivirus to the more out there solutions like managed SOC, etc. All of that is great, but what's really important is that people exercise good behaviors to avoid implementing these technical security controls. Part of that, of course, is being aware of the security landscape and some basic training. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So today we're going to cover a variety of topics related to security awareness. So first, we're going to talk about why you need a security awareness training program, and I think there's a number of reasons that are pretty obvious. We're going to talk about the type of content to consider, what exactly belongs in a typical security awareness program for the average business or organization, and we're going to get into philosophies regarding that. We're going to talk about things like the frequency and effort for training, the balance between educating people, giving them the tools and knowledge they need without overburdening them. We'll get into depth of contact. How far do we actually go with this? Are we, what deserves a cursory overview versus what needs to be more in depth? We're going to also talk about phishing testing programs, which I believe is an important part of security awareness. Phishing is a very common attack means for cyber criminals to commit fraud, to deploy ransomware, so on and so forth. And I think any security awareness training program in 2018 has to carve out a piece in particular about phishing and social engineering. We're going to talk about how compliance and rules impact your training program. So how, depending on what kind of industry you're in, what kind of data you have, how that may impact how you approach training. And then finally, we're going to talk about the ideas of attitude, positivity, and the culture of awareness. Pardon me. Once again, we really want people to buy into security awareness. We want them to believe in it and to exercise behaviors that support it, so that they don't go off and use shadow IT, unauthorized systems, or intentionally violate policy, or not have any awareness or break the rules. And so I believe all of this has to be surrounded by a positive culture. And then, of course, other considerations, just sort of tips and tricks, things to keep in mind. So we'll start off. Why do you need security awareness training? Jill made a very funny joke yesterday. That picture on the right is me. That's my cartoon form. So we had the regular picture of me up front, but we have my cartoon form right here. Most security incidents have a point where the incident could have been stopped if an action had or had not been taken. So consider WannaCry, for example, and the NHS attack last year. So that was I believe it was from phishing, and it really relied on one person clicking through something and getting hit with the ransomware, which exploited the weakness that was existing in the system. Yes, if the weakness been addressed, perhaps the click-through wouldn't have mattered, but also the flip side is had they not fallen in that pothole, the incident also wouldn't have happened. So we really want to get people to exercise good behaviors to avoid potential incidents. Obviously, it's impossible to measure, but aware staff, think about how many cyber incidents we potentially avoided just because we deleted that bad email or because we avoided that dangerous website. It's really important that we acknowledge that. Most people have expertise in what they do and not in IT security. I've met with a number of business leaders, management types, etc., and they're really good at practicing medicine or being a good lawyer or developing efficient manufacturing processes or whatever. But usually that doesn't extend to things like implementing any kind of security program or managing a security team or managing data. Their specialty is in what they were trained to do. So it's important we at least give them a sense of what they're doing with the tools, the technology tools that they control. Regulators often expect it. Sometimes if you're working on a security standard, I was looking at the NIST 800-171 rules this morning for an assessment. One of the requirements is you get security awareness training. And so if you're in a compliant industry, chances are you're going to need it. Threats evolve and change, and it's important to have the right mindset to react to new threats. So, I was talking earlier that one of the things we want to talk about in today's security awareness training programs is phishing. Well, that's a big deal right now, but who knows in, say, 2025, what the most critical threat's going to be, whether phishing is even a concern anymore, or how these threats impact you, et cetera. We need to consistently give people a message that's in line with today's expectations, not the expectations of, say, 10 years ago. And it has a strong return on investment. Again, it's impossible to consider what would have happened had you gotten infected, right? Many people on this call maybe have not experienced a ransomware or some kind of incident that took them down for a week. But imagine had someone done something that had led to that sort of event. If you had a security awareness training program, and let's say you spent a few $1,000s a year on that program, but it avoided one cyber incident that would have caused, say, a day of downtime, you can see pretty quickly how there's a huge return on investment for getting people aware. If we can avoid even if we are not recover, if we can avoid the basic attacks that lead to these costs from downtime and response and repair, we can really justify, from a cost-benefit analysis, a security awareness training program. So what should be included in this kind of program? Almost as important as everything else, I think, a rationale and justification for why you are doing this. So, giving people a series of rules that says you can click here, you can access these files, you can have this password, this is where you can access your stuff, all that's great. We should definitely have rules that limit what people can do, in particular when it pertains to sensitive data. But unless we've really justified it, we've really given people no reason to adhere to the rules or care about the rules. If we are, let's say, in a HIPAA environment, and we're talking about medical information, and the conversation starts with saying, listen, as let's say a medical practice that controls 10,000 patient records or whatever, and we have a duty to our patients, to the federal government, to you as employees, to everybody, to protect this data, and as such, we have to do things like, say, multi-factor authentication. We have to limit what websites people visit. We have to install antivirus. We have to run patches on Tuesday, so on and so forth. I think it leads to a much more positive message and a buy-in from people where they say, hey, yeah, I get it. I get why we're doing this. I get the point of doing cybersecurity awareness, and I'm going to buy into it because it matters to the place I work for, and I have a duty to adhere to that. I just think that's really, really important. We want to define sensitive data and the impact that a loss or breach would have. So unless people understand the consequences, I don't think they can act responsibly. So when someone understands that the loss of patient data or breach of patient data would lead to fines from the federal government, perhaps, in some instances, there could be criminal liabilities if you're particularly negligent, whatever. When you've defined what kind of data you care about and why that stuff matters and the impact to the organization and the individual, should these events happen, again, people will understand a little bit more and they will want to be a part of the process. Common threats. I mean, this kind of goes without saying. We need to get into what people might actually experience, and it has to be spoken to the layperson. So obviously we could speak about things like ransomware, phishing, and viruses, spam, maybe perhaps depending on the industry you're in, things like denial of service attacks, so on and so forth, things that people could potentially see and could be of concern to them. We need to speak practically. I can't get into every particular technology threat that's out there when I'm training people because there's just too much. We have to focus on the low-hanging fruit, the things that people might actually encounter. We want to speak about specific compliance concerns. It means, again, if we're in a medical practice, that's going to be all about HIPAA. If we're taking credit cards, it's going to be PCI, the payment card industry stuff. Or if we're doing government contracting, a lot of this, and especially with the Department of Defense, we're talking about DFARS and the NIST standards. We want to speak to what our compliance concerns are as an organization, what our legal and regulatory obligations are. I also think it's important to have some transparency and explain what kind of tools the organization uses to protect themselves. So we have deployed multi-factor authentication, and we use this product to ensure that the people who are logging into our databases are who they say they are. Because we're getting back to the rationale here, because if someone cracks a password and we don't have multi-factor authentication, then they could access our entire client database, breach data, which leads to an impact to the organization, so on and so forth. If people understand the tools and their function, then they're going to be more inclined to use them. I bring up multi-factor authentication specifically because when people have to do the second login with a key on their phone or something like that, there's always a groan, oh, I can't believe we have to do this. It's just a pain. I don't like getting my phone out and looking at my text message or a token or whatever. I just want to log into my account. Well, if you actually explain the tool, what it's there for, why it provides value to the organization, again, maybe those groans go down a little bit and you get more cultural buy-in. So I think it's important to be transparent about that stuff. I'm going to pivot a little bit, and we're going to talk about what kind of content is necessary for a security awareness training program. And I will say that this is not going to be an exhaustive list. Depending on your situation, there are going to be things that we maybe don't talk about on this list, and maybe things that I haven't even considered that belong on this list. So it's going to be custom to you, but at a broad view, we want to talk about social engineering. It is much, much easier to hack a human than to hack a PC, right? Cracking a password is a time-consuming process. There are tools that can break passwords or get into systems or exploit loopholes in software or whatever. But what's even easier is if somebody sends you a phishing email that says, hey, we need your username and password for your Amazon account in order to perform a system update or whatever baloney they're giving you, and then you voluntarily give up your username and password. Well, that's a lot easier than cracking something. So we really do need to talk about social engineering and how people are being exploited to create during cybercrime. We need to talk a lot about bring your own device. I can't think of too many organizations these days that I work with where people aren't doing some kind of work with sensitive data that the organization cares about, and they're not using their own device. Most of the time, it's maybe someone's iPhone or an Android phone. Other times, it's a laptop that they're using to work from home to remote in, or perhaps maybe a foreign computer at some workspace or a hotel or something like that. We need to talk about what the rules are for bring your own device and what we need to do if we're going to be using devices that maybe aren't centrally managed and owned by the organization. We need to talk about standards, so things like passwords, data sharing, storage rules, etc. What are the rules that we're all operating by? What kind of standards do we need? How often do we change our passwords? What kind of access should we have? Who should we be sharing files with and under what circumstances? So on and so forth. Basically, what are the baseline standards and practices that we need to adhere to? And if you haven't thought about what your standards are, now's a good time. You have to take the sensitive data, and we've done other webinars and training on this stuff, but we want to take the stuff we care about and say, and create a series of reasonable rules that hopefully aren't too burdensome, that operate in such a way that users are acting responsibly and getting positive outcomes out of their access to this data. We want to talk about acceptable use in these training programs. So what is an okay use of your technology and what isn't? So perhaps we're in an office where there is absolutely no personal web browsing happening whatsoever. Maybe that's a little rigid, but that's the rule for this office because we just can't have external web browsing. Or maybe the acceptable use rules need to speak to things like what the work from home rules are. Well, you can work from home, but it's only with this kind of device that you report to management so we can put it in our inventory. Or here are, again, getting back to data sharing, here are the types of data you can share with third parties, and here's the type of data that you're not allowed to share with third parties and the approval rules for doing so. Things like that. Basically, what are the basic guidelines that people are allowed to use before they access these PCs entirely, and what's forbidden? A lot of this will touch on personal use of the computers. I think it's a little naive to expect people to not do some personal touch on their computers. This is just the way things are today. But if that's going to happen, we have to at least draw some boundaries so people can act in a reasonably responsible way. And of course, incident and disaster response. You know, I think we've done trainings in the past on incident and disaster response. The way your staff responds to a potential security incident or some kind of disaster will change the outcome for your organization. If people do not start fiddling with things on their own, violating the spirit of the policy, not communicating, not running it up to the right people, or management doesn't know who to report to in the case of an incident, chances are that the incident is going to have a broader impact. You're going to be down for longer. You could potentially be more liable than you were before. So it's really important that before any incident happens or disaster happens, regardless of whether we expect that to happen or not, that we have a clear plan of who our incident response team is and the sort of triaging that happens when something is found. I also believe in defining the difference between an incident and disaster. So an incident may be a minor thing that happens, just maybe reporting a service ticket because something's not working, versus a disaster where everyone in the organization is impacted. The bottom line here is that we need to have content that speaks, again, practically to what people are doing. We don't need to create a series of security engineers. That's far too much focus. We want to create, instead of a series of security engineers, people who are skeptical and aware of the environment they're working in and what is expected of them. With that, I'm going to pivot a little bit towards the ideas of frequency and effort. This is super important because we need to give people a reasonable amount of weight to take on when it comes to security awareness. If I said to you, hey, we're going to take a full 8-hour day and we're going to give everyone security awareness training, we're going to do this once a month, as you might imagine, there would be quick fatigue on this, a lot of grumbling, so on and so forth. So my view is a little bit different. So first, any kind of training we do really should fit around your staff schedule. You know, I often do lunch and learns where we do events sort of like now where we're doing them at a convenient time where people can maybe bend their schedules a little bit and not feel too burdened by doing it. If you tell somebody they need to do their security awareness training at 8 p.m. after they've completed their work for the day, maybe you're not going to get the best buy-in on that. I think you really need to make it something that they can fit in their day as maybe a small chore instead of a big burden. I believe in consistent touches. So rather than do, like, say, one big training a year, we're going to take a whole week and do security awareness training. I'd rather see small, consistent touch. So for a client I'm working with now on a security awareness training program, my suggestion was that we do quarterly these online exercises that are 20 to 25 minutes long. So basically every quarter, they have the staff has a 1-month window to do an online training where they have to basically interact with a video with a quiz and stuff that's 20 to 25 minutes long. So they get a whole month to do it. It's only one of 3 months that they have to do it, but we're going to touch them just a little bit every so often so that we're sort of tickling their security awareness training muscles in their brain rather than forcing a lot of stuff down their throat, making it just very basic and giving them a little bit of touch. All the language has to be simple and easy to understand. We can't give people language that is over their heads or highly technical. It should speak to the layperson. It should require some user interaction. So obviously people get dull just watching regular videos. We want to have some kind of touch from the end user where they either have to click on a quiz or pick the next module or something to this extent, so that every so often we're making sure people pay attention. And really, in my view, I like the anytime, anywhere training. So it sort of gets around to the must fit around your staff schedule thing. We want training where people can do this no matter what computer they're using, what device they're using, whether they're located in the office or working remotely or traveling at the time. Those sorts of access, if possible, is really nice, because then again it gets people buying into it. It doesn't feel as burdensome, and again we're creating a culture where they want to be a part of it. Excuse me. I'm going to talk a little bit now about the depth of content. So how far are we really going to go with this? You know, what level of detail do we want? When we're doing these consistent touches, like I was suggesting in the previous slide, I think we want to vary between general awareness and industry/organization specific. So usually when I'm starting a program for people on security awareness, the first thing we'll do is just a general awareness type module where it's, here are the basic threats, here's why this is important, you know, big picture security awareness. Give people the general thesis of what security awareness is, what they need to look out for. And then as we go, we're going to get a little bit more specific to the type of industry they're in. So for example, if you're in a medical organization controlling electronic patient health information, we're going to focus a lot about HIPAA compliance and what that means. Same for PCI and payment card industry, so on and so forth. There may also be organization-specific things. Because we're a very mobile workforce, we're going to do training about what to look out for when working on the road, and we're going to focus on that sort of mobile work because that's the way we are, and the things we talk to need to be specific to that. Perhaps we're an organization that has a lot of mobile devices. Maybe we need to have a specific time carved out just to talk about mobile devices and how they enter into security awareness. So it really should speak to who you are. And I would say that when I do these sorts of trainings and set up programs for people, we're not doing the same thing every time. We're mixing it up, and I'm trying to just get feedback so that we can give the best possible content. We definitely don't want to get in the weeds. We need to speak to rationale and consequences. So it's really not that it's really informative for me to say to somebody that every time you share sensitive data with a third party over the public internet, that information should be encrypted so that the information cannot be read as it's transmitted from point A to point B. That's the rationale, right? And it's really important. What's not important for security awareness training is that this is AES 256-bit encrypted or whatever. I mean, that stuff is not important. The technology guys can figure out exactly what type of encryption protocol we use, or how it's deployed, in what scenario, when the thing needs to be renewed, whatever. The management of it should be focused on the technology side. People need to understand what the tool is and why it matters. Again, rationale and consequences are really important here, but not the way the technology works quite as much. Each training, anytime we have a touch with individuals, whether it's a phishing test or general security awareness or mobile device training or whatever, each one of these trainings should be able to stand alone. If somebody new comes on staff and we're already in the middle of a security awareness training program, which we all should be, they should be able to jump in and learn the content that's being presented today, regardless of what's been trained before, at least to some extent. Obviously, there is some stuff that people need to know up front, but we want people to just jump in and be a part of it. And really what we want is we want to have a staff of people that's been trained this entire time on security awareness concerns, and that when a new user jumps in and they start getting their training, that they're sort of absorbing what people have and then gaining the new content with everyone else. So that as that staff churn is going to happen, like every organization, and people come and go, that we just have this culture that exists where everyone's just getting this constant touch. Depending on your role, some individuals may need extra or specialized training. Let's say we have people in an organization that are failing their phishing tests a lot. Usually what I'll do is I'll set up a phishing awareness program just for users who are maybe consistently having difficulty distinguishing phishing tests. Excuse me. We may also, for people of privilege, let's say you have to have a person on staff who has admin rights to everything for whatever reason, generally not a position that most people who are non-technical should have, but let's say we've created a rationale for this. They may need to get more specific training on what they need to do, or if they're a part of the incident response team and you need to be a part of dealing with disasters and incidents, you may need to get extra training that's focused on your role and what your responsibilities are, which wouldn't go out to every staff member. Not every staff member needs to understand how to define the difference between different kinds of disasters. But if you're the one handling the disaster response champion, if you will, you may need to do that. We're going to talk right now about phishing testing, which I generally include as a part of my security awareness training programs. If you're not already aware, a phishing test is basically a fake email. So a phishing email is an illegitimate email designed to get some kind of behavior out of users, get them to click on something, respond, give some kind of email, whatever. When I do a phishing test, I'm trying to mimic what a phishing criminal might do. So, for example, create a company-wide email from Human Resources stating that there's been a change to policy, and click here to read the new policy, and they have to open up a document that is not legitimate. Except when they open up my document, since it's a test, it just warns them about that they failed a test, gives them a little education, so on and so forth. But it's not actually damaging like an actual phishing attack would be. I know I've had a little pushback on this in the past, but generally I like phishing tests to be unannounced. So when I set up a phishing test campaign or program for a client, I will oftentimes just say, hey, here is about what I'm thinking about doing these tests. Are you okay with this? And as long as they're okay with my ideas, I just run with it and I do whatever, whenever. So I don't tell people when those emails are going to go out or what kind of content it's going to be in advance. If they have some ideas up front, we might talk about this, but for the most part, I want to run the show because I want it to be just like a phishing test. Or a phishing attack. You don't know what your phishing attack's going to look like. You don't know if it's going to be a PowerPoint email or an Amazon email or LinkedIn thing. You're just going to receive the attack, and you're not going to be warned about it in advance. And I feel like the test should simulate that. These tests are tracked and monitored, so I know. Beg your pardon, I have a little cough today. I know when these emails are opened, when they're clicked through, when they're replied to, so on and so forth. I know if they don't reach their destination. So, for example, a spam filter blocks them or someone blocks it from a button from their Outlook client. We want to know what happened, when it happened, who clicked on it from one account, so on and so forth. So we can actually see some results and have some data to work with in the future. The content should really vary. Different people will fall for different things. In a real life scenario, I have a client, I'm not going to say who it is, but we have quarterly phishing tests set up for them. And on the first of their annual tests, we had 0 failures. We barely had anybody click through. Nobody really fell for it. It was a banking type email. and nobody fell for it. They were all good. But on the second attack or test that I ran, I made it seem like an HR thing that was talking about a change in policy. Obviously, a totally different message than a bank trying to get you to log into your account or something like that. When I said it was from HR, I got immediate response, and everybody clicked through, and the failure rate was really, really high. And so, as you can see, this organization was really prepared to deal with one kind of phishing attack and maybe not so much with another. By running these different kinds of phishing tests, we're going to find out where people are weak and then kind of improve them as we go. And ideally, in future tests, we want to get the click-through rates to drop. They must educate and provide feedback. A failed test is an opportunity to educate and not shame. So I usually do one of two things when people fail a test. Either I just give a basic rules landing page where it says, hey, you failed the test, here are a few things to keep in mind. That's usually what I'll use if someone clicks on an attachment. But if it's an email with a lot of specific flags, sometimes what I'll do is I will have when they click through and fail the test, we'll go back to the email and it'll actually show them little clues within the email. Hey, if you had noticed this, you might have realized that this is a phishing attack. It's just an opportunity to teach people. We don't want to punish anybody. We want people to learn so that in the future they can respond better. We don't want people to feel bad about it or feel helpless. Compliance and training. I can pretty much tell you that if you are in a industry that requires data management compliance, you're probably going to be required to do some kind of awareness training of some kind. Usually they're not that specific. Sometimes they will specify that they need some things, but oftentimes it's general awareness training. They don't expect you to have a team of security engineers, much like I don't. They expect you to have some skin in the game, that you have staff that is aware and buying into the idea of cybersecurity and awareness. Sometimes it's specific to the data relevant in the standard. So PCI will often talk about in their compliance training that they'll want you to talk specifically about handling of credit cards in their training requirements. They want you to, they seem to care a little bit less about, maybe some of the items I spoke about regarding phishing, and they're very focused on saying, what is your responsibility when you have a credit card number in your hand? Now, that's not to say that somebody on a PCI compliance environment wouldn't want to have those things included as well, but PCI will call for that specific topic. Other times it's just general awareness or both. So, in general, we want to have some kind of documentation or verification. It doesn't have to be sophisticated. Sometimes it's like a little certificate someone can print out. Other times it's just, can we go back and check the records and make sure somebody took the quiz and got a passing grade? We don't need to, again, for most of the time, this doesn't need to be anything very sophisticated or crazy. We don't need a notary to notarize every security awareness test or something like that, but something that shows that staff was given the test, they had a chance to take it, and that they took it. All of this, any kind of security awareness we do, is not a substitute for acknowledging policies. So the acceptable use policies that I mentioned, incident disaster response policies, etc., any kind of general awareness we do or testing we do is not a substitute for giving people a policy, requiring them to read it, and then sign off acknowledging that they've understood what their responsibilities are. We want these things to go hand in hand. They have to acknowledge the policy and sign off on them, but also that users have to get some training so they understand what the security landscape is. We're going to give a little time to the positivity culture. I've talked about it a lot today. It's not always fun, but it shouldn't be unpleasant. We want this to not be onerous. It speaks to why we do frequent small touches. Everything should be positive and not punitive. We want people to participate. So we don't want to threaten people about this stuff. We want people to want to do this and make them happy about doing it and not negative or feel helpless. Mistakes are really an opportunity to learn. So even if we have an incident of some kind, we have to look, assuming that people aren't acting intentionally negligent in violation of policy to commit a crime or really just to do things that they know are wrong, we want to use mistakes as an opportunity to teach people and get better outcomes in the future. If we shame people, then we're going to discourage them from communicating with us, and we're going to get negative outcomes. So we have to take a positive approach. Otherwise, we're liable to have more mistakes in the future. If there's any kind of confusion, the staff needs to feel like they can reach out if they're confused or concerned. As I was just saying before, negative culture leads to poor outcomes. You can really be positive and forward-looking and bring people in, or you can expect users to work around the rules and the standards you see. If people aren't given rationale and explanation and justification and hand-holding for this stuff, then people are going to do whatever they want. People are going to use their cell phones to text things. They're going to use USB drives to take information off-site. They're going to use personal email accounts. They're going to violate policy left and right, because the truth is that no matter what we do with cybersecurity, there are usually ways around this if people have the will. I'm not supposed to share this data, but I took out my cell phone and I took a picture of the data and then shared it via text message. There's not a lot I can do about that aside from confiscating a cell phone when some people walk in the door, and most organizations aren't like that. So we need to give rules that are reasonable so people are not going to feel the temptation to be creative and work around the rules. A few other things to consider. Management and executives need to buy in. They should be active participants. This can't be a situation where, well, it's just the staff that needs it, and management, we get it already. The truth is, when I do phishing testing and security awareness, it's oftentimes management that's falling for this stuff. They are being caught by cyber criminals. They are the ones causing a lot of problems oftentimes, and it's not usually the lower level employees. So I believe everybody needs to be a participant, especially people with the most privilege and the most to lose out of a cybersecurity incident. Before you use technology, before someone gets in, there should be a training requirement, at least acknowledging policy and getting some general awareness. People should not be just given the keys to the car and say, go ahead and drive. People need that kind of training up front. We want to consider both personal touch and passive touch. Oftentimes when I'm creating, excuse me, oftentimes when I'm creating programs, I'm doing things that are both, online videos where maybe I don't talk to every individual user, but oftentimes at the same time we'll do an in-person lunch where I come in and I chat with people. I do a custom PowerPoint, and then at the end we have a Q&A talking about general stuff that people want to talk about that maybe wasn't touching on the subject that I started with, something that they care about. So I like to have things that are passive, but also things that are personal if we have the space. It's always good to relate the content to things that personally impact people. So if you want to create a culture of compliance, the great thing is to say, well, look, you want your personal online banking account to be safe, right? You want your personal medical information to be safe. You want to be able to shop securely, et cetera. Well, the things that we talk about as part of our security awareness program are going to be things that will help you in your personal life if you adhere to them with your own stuff. It's not just for the company or the organization. This is for you. You can use this stuff and save yourself the hassle of cybersecurity incidents in your own life that have nothing to do with us. So learn this stuff and you get a little bit of bonus on the side. And great to seek feedback. If people are having a hard time, if there's a subject matter that they think needs to be covered that they don't know anything about, ask for it. And then if you bring that information to DPS or whoever as part of your security awareness program, we could probably incorporate that kind of knowledge needed into that program. So the back and forth with end users, I think, is super important. That's it for the prepared content. I think I'm going to go back to Jill, and we have some time for questions and answers. I don't know if we've got any questions in yet, but I'll hand it back to Jill.
Okay, thanks, Ben. Yeah, again, if anybody has any questions, please use the question box to go ahead and type them in, and we will ask your questions. Okay, Ben, it looks like we have one that came in. How often should I review or refresh my training programs?
I usually say on an annual basis, you should have just a review. So, you know, usually when for example, when we propose this initially, we'll propose a schedule, and I'll say we want to do, say 4 phishing tests, 4 security awareness programs, insight training, maybe some other touches or whatever based on the organization, and we'll stick with that. But when year 2 comes, we should probably look and see, who's actually participated, any feedback we got from the group, if the content is still relevant, and then change it up. I'm usually working with a number of pieces of content up front, and then I'm sort of filling the holes as it goes. So depending on what I see for the industry, the organization, how people have responded to phishing tests, I'll change the content typically. So I think this should really be kind of a dynamic thing, and at least on an annual basis, we reconsider what we're doing, just at least in terms of content. Maybe the frequency is probably something we should stick with as a program, but the content will vary.
Okay, thank you. Another question came in is, what are the consequences for inadequate security awareness training?
The consequence of inadequate awareness training is more incidents. There are studies, any number of which you could look up, that will say that organizations that don't do phishing testing get phished more. And organizations that don't use security awareness training tend to have more ransomware, malware infections, or adware on their systems. Their systems perform worse. They tend to lose data more. They tend to have data decentralized and not stored, and they tend to just have this data decentralization and splurging, where data just sits everywhere. When people aren't educated on what they need to do, they will act inappropriately. It's not fair to hold people accountable for standards that we haven't articulated to them. So I can guarantee that if you don't have these sorts of things in place, the outcomes will be worse. And if you have a larger organization where you can really have an economy of scale, it's really a no-brainer to do this stuff. It's such a small investment, much less than a lot of other technology solutions out there, and it has an extremely high return. So I think it's essential for almost everybody.
Okay, great. Looks like we have one more question, and this one's about phishing. Is phishing more of a concern for PCs or mobile devices?
I think phishing is a concern for any device. Phishing attacks, perhaps some of the attacks are more focused on one particular device or service than another, but there's nothing stopping it from doing anything. And in the case of the identity theft type attacks, where they're trying to solicit end users to share information that they wouldn't otherwise share, or log into an account, or things like that, it really doesn't matter what device you're using. Other things are going to use targeted ransomware looking for, say, Windows or maybe iOS for an iPhone or whatever. And yeah, so perhaps those tests are more relevant to certain devices than others. But really, when you're talking about phishing attacks, they're really focused more on the users. And since these attacks can be so broad and so expensive to run on a large scale, they are looking basically for whatever talks back to them. So I don't think it is necessarily specific to devices or environment.
Okay, great. Okay, I have another question. You mentioned people or staff tend to fall more for phishing tests when it's related to HR emails, for example. How do you go about training staff on how to avoid falling for this type of test?
That was one specific scenario where they were more likely to fall for an HR thing than a banking thing. I don't think that there's any guarantee that the results will be the same in your organization, person with the question. But that said, part of it is looking at the actual failure results and then using that information to provide more specific training in the future. So because in this organization they had a specific concern with HR, I almost think it's behooving for HR to say, hey, here are the types of things we will communicate to you in email, and here are the types of things we will not communicate to you in email, or what you should respond to it as part of an email. I think the only real solution is using the information that we find, the education we have on who we're dealing with and what their awareness flaws are, to then better to make our communications back to them in terms of more training, more phishing tests, et cetera, more specific to the organization. And this is an ongoing thing. It gets back to the first question we had, which was, what kind of content do we use and where should we go with it? Well, it really is going to how do we reevaluate? Using the information we have on the organization, where we work, what's happened to our organization, the environment we're in, we're going to tailor based on that. And so again, in this case, it was HR, but I don't think that's necessarily going to be the same for different organizations. It depends on the culture we're coming into at the time.
Okay, hopefully that answered your question. That so far looks like that's all the questions we have. So we can go ahead and wrap up, I think.
Yeah, thanks everybody for joining us.
Wait a second, sorry, one more wait, one more did come in. Thanks, Brad. All right. We're in the accounting field and have instances where a client's email is hacked, or maybe ours. The hacker attempts to act like the client lender to request we send a wire to the instructions they include in the email.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the question?
The question is, how do we avoid that, or how should we respond to something like that? Or I'm not totally clear on the question.
Who is being hacked, us or them?
Oh, who is being hacked, us or them? It could be either or neither. For example, let's talk about just a general phishing attack, and I beg your pardon if I'm not completely speaking to your scenario, but someone is pretending to be you, sending an email to a client saying, give me this information. There's a few potential scenarios. One is that someone has compromised your actual email server and is sending that and using your email to try and, acting within your system to get information back. That's obviously a big concern because they've already penetrated your system and now they're using your technology against you. Another is that the end user's email account is somehow compromised, or they're on some list where they know that you're getting these kinds of emails, or they're getting these kinds of emails from you, the vendor, and therefore are going to simulate those emails to them to try and get them to bite, to give them that information. And you have nothing to do with this, right? They're just pretending to be you. The third is just dumb luck, right? Where you've got what I would call email spoofing, where no one's actually being hacked, no one's actually compromised any accounts. They're just pretending to be someone, and the only thing they know is that there is an email account that they can send information to, which is just generally publicly available information that you can find on a user because they're published on a website. My information, for example, which you can see on the screen right now, is available on our public website. People can send me all sorts of phishing attacks if they wanted to, because that information is available. Now, I'm not likely to fall for it, both because I tend to think I'm an expert, but also because I am looking for specific types of attacks. I'm looking for things, and I have tools in place to protect myself. But anybody can send these things. It's why phishing is such a popular way to attack. You don't actually have to compromise a system to begin an attack to phish somebody. All you need is an email address, and email is by design meant to be a little bit more open. As long as you have the address to send to, you can send them information and by extension get a response. I would say if you're concerned about the security of your system, that your system could be compromised by such a thing, we should really be pivoting to another conversation that we could have offline, which is performing some kind of technology assessment to determine if your system is secure, if things, you're subject to that kind of compromise, or so on and so forth. And there are tests we can run to evaluate that level of risk.
Okay, Brad, hopefully that answered your question. You can get in touch with Ben if you have further questions after this webinar. Okay, we did have another question come in during that, Ben. If you fall victim to phishing, is the fix just to change your password, or could the phisher have planted something in the system that could be activated later? How do you/we know?
Yes to both. So, I mean, they could just be asking for information, and then you might have to change your account, right? Let's say it's a phishing email and it's asked you for your Amazon credentials and you put them in. Well, then obviously the thing is to secure your Amazon account, and that's the thing you're concerned about. it could be that they left something on your machine. Now, you could, some antivirus tools can scan, or anti-malware tools can scan and see if your machine's been compromised. There are more sophisticated tools like network monitoring tools that look for suspicious traffic that happens on the network. That's obviously a higher end solution that we should have, again, a much more in-depth conversation on. There's the question about vulnerabilities in general that need to be tested. You'd actually need to have an evaluation. I would say if you think you fell victim to a phishing exercise, this is really the time where we need to sit down and have a general assessment and say, what are we doing about cybersecurity? What have we fallen for? What should we do about it? In other webinars we've done, we've talked a lot about the post-incident response. So disaster planning is not just having solutions in place to respond to an incident and recover from it, but also after the incident happens to say, what was the incident? Are we sure it's over? How can we evaluate how exposed we are to these incidents in the future? So on and so forth. And if you haven't had that conversation yet after having, say, been the victim of a phishing attack, you really should. And DPS would be happy to be a part of that conversation. So I think that's really where you would go next.
Okay, thanks, Ozzy. Hopefully that answered your question. I think that's about it for now. So Ben, if we want to go ahead and wrap up, again, I just want to let everyone know that we will have a recording posted on our website a little bit later today, and I'll also send out a follow-up email.
Thanks everybody for attending. My contact information is here. You could also reach out if you're a client to one of your account managers or really anybody at DPS, and we'll make sure if you have follow-up questions about this or any other sort of security, risk management, IT management concerns, feel free to bring it to us, and we want to be a part of these conversations moving forward. And thanks so much for participating in this webinar, and we'll be doing another one again real soon. Make sure you sign up for more of them. We like doing them.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, bye-bye.